Hello again, everyone. Adam Elwanger here at the University of Houston downtown. It's been a while since I talked with you. These lectures are for my course in Rhetorical Theory and Criticism, and we've been talking recently about ethos, or the way that identity is formed and perceived, and the role that it plays in processes of persuasion and communication. And today, this afternoon, I'd like to talk a bit about Francis Fukuyama's new book called Identity, the Demand for Dignity, and the Politics of Resentment. It's a very new book. I think it's been out for about 8 months now. And it's very timely. And of course, Professor Fukuyama is a brilliant guy. You may know him from his book, The End of History and the Last Man, which was a response to basically the conclusion of Soviet communism and the fall of the Soviet Union. And what he was talking about there was the way that it seemed that capitalist democracy or market democracy had essentially won a lasting victory. That the economic and ideological clashes that had defined much of the previous 2 or 3 centuries had been resolved, and that going forward the world would look increasingly democratic, increasingly market-oriented. And that seemed to be coming right along until some of the events in the early 21st century that Fukuyama details in this book. So today I thought that we would begin by recapping some of the ideas about identity that we've been talking about in the course and in the last few lectures. And then I thought that we'd get into sort of Fukuyama's argument here. And then we'll talk about the relation of this argument to the topic of rhetoric specifically. Sorry, I'm in the conference room at our English department here, and there's a bunch of paintings stacked up against this wall which keep tripping me. But they're all moved now, so we're good. So let's talk about identity. Identity and identification. Identification. 2 concepts that we've been talking about at length in the course. Identity is particularity or difference. Sometimes when an adolescent is finding his or her identity, if they go through such a period, often what that process means is finding the ways that you differ from your family, finding the ways in which you're an individual, figuring out the things that are unique about you. It separates and differentiates yourselves from other people and other groups to which you may have connections. So, identity is inherently individualistic. It's individualistic. In other words, we want to define ourselves as different and separate from other things and other people. Identification is a little bit different. Identification is what we might call group identity. It's when we look at ourselves and then look to the outside and see some common characteristics in another group or in other people that we feel like we share. And this is a very simple process. You don't need to look much further than sports fandom. This is the way that fandom works, right? I'm a big fan of the Buffalo Sabres hockey team. If I see someone else in a Sabres shirt, I immediately feel some connection to that person, even if that's a fairly arbitrary connection. And I might go up to them and say, "Hey, you're a Sabres fan. I like your shirt. What do you think? How are they doing this season?" "Oh, yeah, I know. They blew it again. Can you believe they won those 12 games in a row at the beginning of the season? And here we are again sitting outside of a playoff spot?" That's for you, Sabres. I'm sure you're watching this. Shape up. Seriously. Okay, so anyways, that's identification, right? We look at another group outside of ourselves and see something of ourselves in that other group. And so, identification is a movement towards the collective that often entails some suppression of the aspects of ourselves that differ from the commonalities that are shared by the larger group. Now, one of the interesting things about the modern era that we live in is that individual identity has come to be increasingly important over the last 2 centuries. So, for much of recorded history, who you felt yourself to be, how you felt yourself to be particular or different or unique, just didn't matter much to anyone but you. And so if you grew up, on a pig farm in the 14th century, then you were a pig farmer. That's who you were. That's your identity. And if you went to your father at 13 years old and said, "Dad, I know we're pig farmers, but I just need to sing," your father probably isn't going to have a positive reaction to that. In fact, he'll probably laugh in your face, right, and say, "Get out and feed the pigs. We're pig farmers. You can sing while you're feeding the pigs. Go ahead," right? And of course, sure, there's still some fathers who are going to laugh in the face of their son who just feels like they can't be personally satisfied until they win American Idol, right? But there is a collective social sense where if individual X says, "Look, I know I'm a singer, this is what I'm meant to be," right? Then there is some sense that needs to be respected. Right? And American Idol is actually a very good example of this, the politics of the self that we see there. Now, of course, there's some people who come on American Idol for the joke, right? They're terrible singers, and that's the funny thing. They go to the audition because they just want attention for how terrible they are. Those people don't interest me, right? It's not really funny, and it's obvious, right, that they're there. The people that interest me are the people who, they do the whole backstory on, who are like, ever since I was 2, I've been singing in the choir, and, now my mother's got cancer, and I know that, if I could just win this competition, our lives would be so much different. I know this is my destiny, right? And then that person goes in to sing, and perhaps they sing beautifully, right? But then the judges say, "Sorry, nope, you're not going to Hollywood, right? You didn't get picked," right? And that moment where that person is shocked, right? Because that was supposed to be their destiny, right? Well, in that moment of rejection, one of 2 things must be possible. Either A, this person was wrong about who they are, right? As it turns out, they were just a pig farmer, right? They weren't meant to be, Clay Aiken or a singer, right? That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, nothing's changed. I'm still a singer. This is still my destiny. This just wasn't the moment that it was meant to happen, right? In other words, right, we can't let go of this self. And so I guess what I'm saying here is that modern people are uniquely connected to the idea that the ideal self they see within themselves not only must be brought into being, it must be respected by those outside. And I think this is the context in which Fukuyama finds us when he begins his political analysis. And so he begins by giving a history, really, of the last 30 or 40 years of American life, but also global life. So I thought I'd read for a moment. He begins, this is the very beginning of the book, he says, if you're following along, this is on page 3. He says, sometime in the middle of the 2nd decade of the 21st century, that's our decade right now, world politics changed dramatically. The period from the early 70s through the mid-2000s, so period 1 is 1970s to 2000-ish, right? That's our first period. That period witnessed what Samuel Huntington labeled the 3rd wave of democratization, as the number of countries that could be classified as electoral democracies increased from about 35 to more than 110. That's a shocking growth of democracy, right? So this period was marked by major growth of democracy as a system of government at the world level. In this period, he says, liberal democracy became the default form of government for much of the world, at least in aspiration, if not in practice. He says, in parallel to this shift in political institutions was a corresponding growth of economic interdependence among nations, or what we call globalization. Globalization, then, this is the era of globalization. The latter was underpinned by liberal economic institutions such as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or its successor, the World Trade Organization. These were supplemented by regional trade agreements such as the European Union, which we now see Britain fighting to exit, and the North American Free Trade Agreement, which may also be finalized as kaput very soon. Throughout this period, the rate of growth in international trade and investment outpaced global GDP growth and was widely seen as the major driver of prosperity. Between 1970 and 2008, the world's output of goods and services quadrupled, and growth extended to virtually all regions of the world, while the number of people living in extreme poverty in developing countries dropped from 42% of the total population in 1993 to 17% in 2011. The percentage of children dying before their 5th birthdays declined from 22% in 1960 to less than 5% in 2016. So in other words, let's pause and look at those statistics and say that is a resounding success for market democracy during that period. Think about that, right? So this myth that the poor just keep getting poorer is false, right? The rich are getting richer, and they're getting richer faster than the poor are becoming less poor, right? But the poor are getting richer, or at least they were. Let's keep going, right? He says, this liberal world order, however, did not benefit everyone. By the way, let's pause and define what we mean by liberal here, because we're used to hearing the term used in the way that it gets used on cable news networks, right? So, if we hear Fox News saying liberal, we think what they really mean is the sort of torchbearers of the Democratic Party, right? If we hear MSNBC say liberal, we think that they mean, good progressives, right? But that's really not what Fukuyama means. Fukuyama is talking about classical liberalism. And this is something that Americans during this time of polarization should remember, I think, is that we're all liberals in this sense, or at least virtually every single one of us, right? There's some people who are not, right? So what does this liberal mean then if it encompasses Democrats and Republicans and people of various political stripes in the United States? Well, what it means is that we all value a society that's premised on justice, individual rights, freedom, and equality. And sometimes I think that we overstate the polarization or the range of the disagreement that separates the American public. Because I think, if we're being honest, even about our political opponents, right, that, both sides want justice. Neither side is saying, I want injustice, right? One side may think that the other side's vision of justice is unjust. But nobody says they want injustice. Nobody says they don't want individual rights. Nobody says they don't want freedom. Nobody says they don't want equality, right? Rather, our arguments are over what does justice mean? Which rights? What kind of freedom? What kind of equality? We all agree these are good things. We just disagree on how to activate them. Okay, but let's keep going then. So, he says, he's still talking about this period right here, by the way. This liberal world order did not, however, benefit everyone. In many countries around the world, and particularly in developed democracies, inequality increased dramatically, such that the many benefits of growth flowed primarily to an elite, defined primarily by education. Since growth was related to the increasing volume of goods, money, and people moving from one place to another, there was a huge amount of disruptive social change. In developing countries, villagers who previously had no access to electricity suddenly found themselves living in large cities, watching TV, or connected to the internet via ubiquitous cell phones. Labor markets adjusted to new conditions by driving tens of millions of people across international borders in search of better opportunities for themselves and for their families, or else seeking to escape intolerable conditions at home. Huge new middle classes arose in countries such as China and India, but the work they did replaced work that had been done by older middle classes in the developed world, right? So in other words, during this period of globalization, what we realized is that there were two prime beneficiaries. Number one, Western elites, who got increasingly richer because they enjoyed their spoil of the increased wealth, the wealth that was produced by commerce. The other group that benefited was people who were poorer in undeveloped parts of the world. And the sad truth here is that in the economic game, there are winners and there are losers, right? And in the global economic game, it turned out often that the losers were the middle classes of developed Western society, okay? So, let's continue reading. Here he talks about the break, right? This next period of 2000 to, let's say, 2010, right? This is the bottom of page 4. He says, beginning in the mid-2000s, the momentum toward an increasingly open and liberal world order began to falter, then went in reverse. This shift coincided with two financial crises, the first originating in the U.S. subprime market in 2008 that led to the subsequent Great Recession, and the second emerging over the threat to the euro and the European Union posed by Greece's insolvency. In both cases, elite policies produced huge recessions, high levels of unemployment, and falling incomes for millions of ordinary workers around the world. Since the United States and the EU were the leading exemplar, these crises damaged the reputation of liberal democracy as a whole. Okay. And also during this time, we see the Arab Spring, right? Other movements and major crises, really, in terms of what direction governments will take going forward. Okay. Then he says, more surprisingly, and perhaps even more significant, he's getting very close to today now, he says, were the two big electoral surprises of 2016. Britain's vote to leave the European Union and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. In both cases, he says, voters were concerned with economic issues, particularly those in the working class who had been exposed to job loss and deindustrialization. In other words, those situations were driven largely by the losers in this global economy. He says, continuing on, but just as important was opposition to continued large-scale immigration, which was seen as taking jobs from native-born workers and eroding long-established cultural identities. All right. So by now, this should be what he's doing is taking a few pages to explain how we got to the moment we find ourselves at now. And then he begins to describe the present. Okay, so we could argue this is the period of globalism, this is the period of rupture, right? And that today, the present, at least in Fukuyama's characterization, is the moment of the crisis, I think. So if we go halfway down, he begins talking about today. This is halfway down page 6. He says 20th century politics had been organized along a left-right spectrum defined by economic issues, where the left wanted more equality and the right demanded greater freedom. All right, so really the left-right spectrum was just a disagreement over which of these two things was the more important. He says, in the second decade of the 21st century, that's our decade, right, the spectrum appears to be giving way in many regions to one defined by identity. The left has focused less on broad economic equality and more on promoting the interests of a wide variety of groups perceived as being marginalized: blacks, immigrants, women, Hispanics, the LGBT community, refugees, and the like. The right, meanwhile, is redefining itself as patriots who seek to protect national identity, an identity that is often explicitly tied to race, ethnicity, or religion. Okay, so in other words, he sees what is the crisis? It's that both the left and the right seem to be not dedicated to these overarching principles, right, but rather to concerns with identity. And so in the Democratic Party and groups to the left of the Democratic Party, we see this fixation with minority groups, with marginalized peoples, with history, victimhood, this kind of thing, right? The right, meanwhile, is equally identitarian, or at least some of the major strains of it are. And we see this, right, partly in the campaign of Donald Trump, which asserted the importance of national identity, which could be read, I think Fukuyama reads it as such, I don't necessarily, but he reads that as sort of race, as Caucasian, and as English-speaking, as Christian, these kinds of things. So he sees that both sides of the political spectrum are now increasingly identitarian. And then he gets to his claim from the subtitle. He says, this might be called a politics of resentment. And here we should be hearing echoes of Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morality, where he talks about ressentiment, the man of resentment who defines the sort of modern malaise. Right? He says, Fukuyama says, in a wide variety of cases, a political leader has mobilized followers around the perception that the group's dignity has been affronted, disparaged, or otherwise disregarded. This resentment engenders demands for a public recognition of the dignity of the group in question. Let's pause there. That the identity demands a public recognition of the group's, of the dignity of the group in question. So we've said that the only way that one can perform an identity, think about the examples that we've given before of Caitlyn Jenner or Rachel Dolezal. Caitlyn Jenner saying, well, look, who I am as a woman. Rachel Dolezal saying, I'm a black woman, right? The only way that they can inhabit that identity is if people are willing to recognize it as authentic or legitimate. And this is the reason that Fukuyama observes that increasingly groups are demanding a public recognition of the dignity so that they can live it, right? Okay, and so this politics of resentment, this feeling of mistreatment that drives identity politics is Fukuyama's primary concern here. So just to give some quick examples of some of these identity politics groups, would be the one example he gives is Al-Qaeda, right? And driven by bin Laden's ideology that sort of Muslim identity has been undermined by sort of Western imperialism or even Western capitalism, and that this aggrieved or bruised sense of Islamic identity is what motivates radical Islamic groups to undertake some of the acts of aggression against the West that they have. Another example would be Black Lives Matter, right? In the wake of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, there was this perception in much of the black community that they were not being treated fairly by law enforcement, and that in fact, in some cases, their lives were targeted or erased because they were viewed as inferior to a white majority, right? And so that anger and resentment is what fueled the movement, right? And I think we could say certain pockets of the president's support also reflect this. And if you want my take, on, well, I mean, I might as well pause and give it, right? I don't think that Donald Trump's campaign was an inherently racist or nativist one. In fact, I don't think he said much that was unusual for recent presidential candidates. Perhaps the frankness, right, with which he said it was a little more jarring than previous candidates. But I don't think that there was anything that unusual about what he said. Nevertheless, I think there is a portion of his support that is explicitly identitarian and nationalist. And I'll tell you why I think that is because, right, we've privileged identity, and a number of minority identities are recognized as legitimate ways of inhabiting public space. So sort of your identity as a Hasidic Jew, right, is an acceptable way to publicly identify yourself and express your individuality. The same as sort of a Latino or a woman in terms of identifying as a feminist. Right? These are all legitimate ways to inhabit social space in the United States. However, right, increasingly, sort of white, maleness, right, is not a legitimate way to express your public identity. In other words, like, while these people could say, look, if you really want to understand me, you have to understand my commitment to women's issues, or this or that. It's a totally legitimate public statement, right? But what is not a public statement is like, well, if you really want to understand me, you really need to understand sort of white masculine issues, right? Everybody will say, whoa, right? What? You can't do that, right? You can't do that. And I think what happened in Trump's campaign is that a certain group of the populace who, like Fukuyama says, feel aggrieved, right, recognize that identity is the only game in town, right? And that one's value to sort of the United States writ large is based in one's difference, right? And so I think that a lot of particularly young, frustrated white men, right, recognize, well, this is what matters, is my individual different identity. And all these people get to perform that. And so they get to express value in relation to the larger project. But I can't express that value, right? I don't have an identity. Sometimes people talk about the invisibility of whiteness, and it's interesting because here it's actually that invisibility that's fueling the frustration of, I think, a lot of younger people who are acolytes of the president. But what they say, I think, is that if this is the only game in town, and you're saying I can't play, well, then, right, the basis of their identity becomes this. That's the basis of the identity. Right? Now, I'm not saying that's true about all Trump supporters, but what I'm saying is that it's not that the less desirable component of Trump's support is racist or sexist or whatever. It's rather that what this means for them is an expression of resentment against identity politics. Okay, and like Fukuyama says, that's an example of the politics of resentment that he describes. And it's just one example of many that seem to be driving our political discourse in the United States. So I'm going to break the video here, and part 2 will discuss Fukuyama's description of Plato's concept of the soul as he describes it in the Republic. And then we will talk a bit about how this relates to rhetoric. Thanks.